So much, Camille, and welcome everyone. Yeah, I think I don't need to introduce myself any further, but I work for UNDP's Biodiversity Finance Initiative, which is a global program operating in 40 countries, where we design and support the implementation of what we call biodiversity finance plans. And so I'm going to try to share what that means. But before going into that sort of detailed topic, I just thought it's useful to explain a bit more two things that we don't want to assume that you're all aware of. First of all, what is actually UNDP, right? So UNDP is the United Nations Development Program. So when the United Nations were founded, they soon realized that there was a need to have a lot of technical assistance programs address things like poverty and later also environment. And that led to the foundation of UNDP in the 60s. And UNDP is mainly focusing on areas like good governance, poverty reduction, and increasingly the environment, working in 170 countries around the world. So it's one of the largest UN agencies. And then the second topic that needs some demystification is what is actually biodiversity? So it's a kind of abstract concept for a lot of people, and therefore we sometimes say just consider biodiversity and nature is the same thing. Of course, it's not exactly the same. Biodiversity specifically is really about the variety of species that we have and the variety of the gene pool and the variety of ecosystems. And why is it so much necessary to work on this? Well, because our biodiversity isn't doing very well on our planet, and I'm going to just show you an example now. Just a second. I'm going to make a comparison for you with a small town in Netherlands called Volendam that maybe you all know about. This is not known to be a very sizable place in the Netherlands, but it has a population of around 22,000 people. Now let's compare that to some of the very well-known species around the world. So actually the global tiger population, I'm not sure if you're all aware that there are less than 4,000 tigers remaining. And if we look at giant pandas, another very famous species, only 2,000 to 3,000. Mountain gorillas, only 1,000. And in the Philippines, we have something called the tamara, a wild buffalo, only 480 remain. I'm going to get back to that one later. And there are a lot of species that are almost gone. Like, for example, the Sumatran rhino, there's estimated there are around 80 left. So if you want to answer the question, why should we invest in biodiversity? Well, because there's simply something wrong with the planet if we look at this kind of data. And I have another example for you, chickens. So if you look at chickens, there are estimated to be 25 billion chickens in the world. But if you look at the estimates of all bird species in the wild, and of course, these are like initial estimates, but anyway, they end up to be around 50 billion in total. So this goes to show that we basically turned the planet into some kind of farm to feed us. And we have to pay more attention to all the other species. And actually, we're quite dependent on them as well in many ways. So these are just examples to put this kind of work into perspective. And let me now continue to try to explain what the program I'm working for, Biofin, is trying to do about it. So now we know that we need to do something about biodiversity. And then the question is how? Actually, if you look at the first generation conservation programs, there wasn't usually much attention for finance until 2010. There was something done here and there on protected area finance, on some trust funds, some debt for nature swaps, really cool mechanisms were being tried. But it was sort of not enough a topic in its own right. And that started to change about 2010, when there was a big global meeting in Nagoya in Japan, where they decided on the next strategy for the next decade for biodiversity. And there was an understanding that most of the global biodiversity goals were not being achieved. And why is that? Well, because there was one reason was there was simply too little attention for finance. But as well, there was another conclusion that countries actually don't know how much they're spending and they don't know how much finance they need. So that kind of led to the mandate of Biofin. You can here see a kind of theoretical example of that. So if you look at a given country, you'll be in the situation of the left column, where we have already some spending on biodiversity, but countries don't really know how much. So that data has not been measured. And second, there are also a lot of financial needs. But again, there's no comprehensive measurements on how much finance you actually need to achieve the biodiversity goals. So if you want to develop a finance plan, we need to have this baseline data, because if you want to develop financial targets, you have to know first how much you need. And so that's the left column. And then comes the most important part of the Biofin process, is to design a biodiversity finance plan and also implement it. And that should read then in a reduction of the financial needs. That is the right column. That's the situation we're trying to achieve in countries after a number of years. And what I really want to highlight is it's a very comprehensive approach. It's not just trying to raise more money, which is obviously needed, but also we want to really look at, you see in the middle column, that's what we call financial results. We want to realign expenditures away from things that harm nature, hopefully towards things that benefit nature. So we want to make finance flows nature positive. And so we don't want to just increase, but we want to reduce the needs as well, because if we do that, we spend less on harmful things and we need actually less money for conservation as well. But there's a third element, a third dimension of the Biofin approach I want to highlight as being very important, is what you see here as called deliver better. We also want to look at effectiveness of finance. So not just want to raise more money and get it away from things that are harmful, but we also want to do more with the money that we already have. If we have public budgets, how can we achieve more by, for example, having strategic goals or better financial processes to do more with the finance that's already available? And those three ingredients should then lead to a reduction of the finance gap at national level and hopefully as well at the global level. Now, if you look at this graph, it shows a bit more detail on how that's then being operationalized in practice. So we have a number of steps in this Biofin methodology. I'm going to just briefly touch on them. But the first one is what's called the policy and institutional review. So even before we measure how much a country is spending, we have to know who we should talk to. So this helps to identify the most important stakeholders on biodiversity, looking at what are the drivers of loss and gain in the country. That leads you to the question on who you should talk to see how much they're spending on biodiversity. But also in this review, we are looking at the whole policy framework for biodiversity for the country, and we're also looking at what are the mechanisms that are already there. Most countries have a lot of mechanisms, so unless we have mapped those well, we cannot develop a financing strategy either. And the second step is to do a biodiversity expenditure review. Here, we look at all the sectors, so not just the environment ministry, but actually agriculture, tourism, fisheries, infrastructure, anyone, and see how much they're actually spending on biodiversity. And it includes also the private sector, although I can safely say that this is mission impossible. Right now, private sector doesn't have much data on biodiversity, and we hope this is one of the things that's going to change in the coming years. And then the next step is financial needs assessment. So how do we do that? How do you actually calculate those needs? Well, every country has a biodiversity plan, and that plan has targets. And so we do a costing exercise on how much it will cost to achieve all of those targets. And that will then represent your financial needs. And in reality, we also look at other policies. Then we have really good baseline data at the national level. And that brings us to the next step, the design of the biodiversity finance plan. So here we are looking at what are the most promising mechanisms for the country to really scale up or realign finance to fill that finance gap at the national level. So you can imagine there are maybe 5 or 10 or 15 different financing mechanisms selected by the country. And it goes through a rigorous process of national consultation. And that those mechanisms, those we call them finance solutions, they have their own targets, and collectively they should be able to fill the finance gap. And then comes actually the most critical step is then implementation, because a lot of similar initiatives, they help to develop a kind of plan, but unless those plans are used, it's not helpful, of course. And we started this journey with 12 countries in 2014, then it grew to 19, then 30, now it's growing to 40. And the 30 countries that were in our phase 1, they're now only focusing on this implementation stage. And 10 new countries, they're only doing those finance plans. And we work really all around the world. So you can just imagine, I work for example in Mexico, Brazil, Peru, South Africa, Uganda, Kazakhstan, India, Thailand, Philippines are just some of the examples. But also when we started this process at the global level, we realized that this could be really kind of studies, and this could be really about data, and that's not what we want. We want to change the way the country thinks about biodiversity finance. We want to change the way that's being perceived. We want biodiversity to be seen as a prime investment category for public and private finance. And so we help to develop this kind of partnership agenda. And the most important partnership we want to strengthen is between ministries of environment and ministries of finance. Ministries of environment, they're usually really looking at the environmental and conservation side, and they don't always have a strong financing capacity. And they have to know better what are the financing mechanisms. They need like economists, public finance experts, and so on. So we have to strengthen their financial capacity. And then if you look at financial ministries, they have amazing financial capacity, but they don't really know that much about biodiversity. So we have to develop.
Let's ask on Monday, maybe.
We have to help them to develop a better understanding.
Yeah, and as we said on.
Better understanding of what biodiversity is, what it means for the economy, and how we can generate more resources for it, and promote this very holistic approach to financing. And also, the private sector, of course, is inevitably a really critical partner in this process. And I don't want to miss out also civil society, because especially when you look at the local level, who are the guardians of all this beautiful resources? They're often indigenous groups, local communities. They're actually doing our job by conserving nature around the world. And so we have to involve them to identify the best financing mechanisms that work for them and that benefit them. Now, I want to share some examples from what we're doing in countries. So just before doing that, I just want to put this into perspective. When you design these finance plans, every country so measures then how much they're spending, and we actually did a kind of modeling based on the data that we generated through that, how much the world is spending. And so we found that the world is spending $121 billion per year on biodiversity. And that sounds like a really good number, but if you compare it to two other numbers, it sounds suddenly less good. So if you look at the financial needs of the world, that's around 600 billion. So that's quite a big gap between those. And if you look at data of the OECD, how much we're spending on things that harm nature, it's around $500 billion per year. And so it just echoes again that we need this comprehensive approach to financing, looking not just at generating more funds, but also realigning this, what you can call negative expenditures or harmful expenditures. And so how have countries done that? So we are working on more than 150 financing solutions across countries. So I obviously can share only very few of them. And let me start with Guatemala. In Guatemala, when they did this expenditure review, they found that coastal municipalities are not spending anything on coastal protection, zero. And of course, they wanted to change that. So we helped to create what we call a finance solution to develop a new budget line and new budget proposals for coastal protection. And that worked rather well. And over the past 2 years, 5 municipalities have seen new budget allocations of around $1 million collectively for coastal protection. So they at least reduce the gap a little bit there. And there's a second mechanism that's interesting from Guatemala. It's related to sailfish. That's a sector that the private sector wants to develop very strongly, so sport fishing. But they also want to make sure they do it in a sustainable way. And so they asked us for an advice, what can we do? So now we help to generate a new fund for the conservation of sailfish and their surrounding ecosystems. And this fund will get money from two sources. First of all, sports fishing fees, and second, from donations. Then let me move to Mexico, which is a really interesting country from our work, because we work there, for example, at the city level with Mexico City. And it was actually the first city in the world that did this kind of biodiversity expenditure review. And you may think that's a kind of mega city. They're not having any nature, but actually they have quite some national parks and volcanoes there, and they have quite a progressive government. And they also have a green fund that we help to sort of redesign. It has around $60 million turnover per year. And we help to redesign it, and we help to realize a saving of $2 million per year. So they're quite appreciative of that, but that's not the only thing. We also help to let it better focus on biodiversity. So a lot of finance mechanisms that are called green or sustainable, not always including nature as one of their primary goals. And so this is something we see a lot around the world. So environment, green, climate, biodiversity, they're somehow related, but they don't equate each other. And we're also working on other things like disclosure frameworks, and we're helping to set up an accelerator fund to enable small companies to attract more investments for things that are considered to be biodiversity positive. Then next example I want to highlight is coming from Botswana. So every country in the world pretty much has protected areas already formally proclaimed. And in Botswana, it's a huge income earner. But when we did this same analysis, we found that actually the fees are relatively low because they hadn't been updated in a long time. So we strongly recommended to update them. And so we reviewed more than 25 different fees, and that has been recently approved by the cabinet of Botswana. And it should generate more than $1 million per year from those protected areas. Although this is a pre-COVID estimate, so we have to see. But this is something for the long term. It's not changed for this year or next year, but those fees will, of course, remain in place. Then the next example is coming from Zambia, where we work on designing a green bond framework. So there was a lot of interest in the public and private sector to work on green bonds, but there was no national framework. So we helped to design that. And also we're trying to see how biodiversity can be well integrated there. We're working with the Securities Commission. And that was also approved in April 2020. This green bond framework has been formally adopted. And now they're trying to see what could be the first green bond to be issued in Zambia, although the time is not really on our side because of the debt situation and of course the pandemic. But again, this is something for the long term as well. Then the next example is coming from Kazakhstan. In Kazakhstan, we're working on a number of different mechanisms. And the first one I want to highlight is actually carbon offsets or carbon markets. So the country really sees this as an opportunity, and in particular, looking at forestry. And they have huge land. I mean, Kazakhstan is bigger than Germany and France combined, I believe. And they need a national framework again on that. So we actually helped to design a new legislation on carbon offset related forestry, build capacity and develop the right guiding tools. But we also supporting some pilot work because there was no real carbon offset related forestry done in the country. And a blockchain company stepped in and said, hey, we are building a data center here. We want to offset the emissions. And they put actually more than $1 million in the first offset on forestry in the country. And we feel that this is one of the global growing markets, because everyone who wants to go green is having to do some kind of offsetting. It's almost inevitable, I think, for many sectors that offsetting will be part of the picture. But in many countries, there's actually limited possibility to do that. So I'm talking about the voluntary markets. The next example is coming from Sri Lanka. And as you can see, it's kind of showing that every country chose their own mechanisms. And that is kind of what we like. So the idea should be kind of homegrown and strongly supported by national stakeholders. So in Sri Lanka, they worked on a mechanism called payment for ecosystem services. And there are different models of this. I mean, it was once pioneered by a French water company called Heuvel that started to pay landowners and users in the area for sustainable use of the land and water. You know, especially using less pesticides so that the water quality remains at a good level. And this is the mechanism that is used in a similar way in Sri Lanka. But Sri Lanka had never used this model before. So it's the first model for payment for ecosystem services in Sri Lanka that was piloted. And a hydropower company has invested already in that, paying landowners to make sure that water levels are staying at a certain level. Another example from Sri Lanka is a sustainable finance strategy. So here we work with the central bank. And again, just to highlight, we work in each country with quite different stakeholders, but also commercial banks and the IFC. So we developed at the national level a sustainable finance strategy. It's quite a bottom-up voluntary kind of policy, but everyone does make commitments under that. So the central bank, as well as commercial banks and other financial institutes, each have their action agenda under this plan and implementing them. And we are bringing them together to discuss about that and report progress. The next example comes from Thailand, and I just noticed that my colleague from Thailand also joined, which is wonderful. We have really exciting work there. We're doing conservation license plates. So that if you buy a certain license plate with, for example, tiger, you pay a premium and that money goes to tiger conservation. But the one I wanted to highlight here is actually crowdfunding. Last year, we saw, of course, that with the COVID-19 pandemic, suddenly a lot of vulnerable communities around the world ran out of money almost overnight. And we needed to do something to help them. And we were already working on the island of Koh Tao, and we decided to do a crowdfunding campaign there. But it's not just giving money, actually it's what we call a cash for work program. So there is a kind of concept that local boatmen who were before guiding tourists around, they're earning some money by doing specific tasks. And it's mainly about cleaning up the beaches and the corals, because unfortunately, while tourists were not coming, our waste was still coming through the oceans. And so they helped to clean it up, and that raised more than $92,000. I must say most of that came actually from Thailand, so people proved to be very supportive. And we also concluded it's more, the less people are connected to the cause and the context, maybe the less likely they're able to give money. But it also shows that you can, even if you're working on a remote basis, you can do something for conservation somewhere else in the world. And there are a lot of crowdfunding campaigns ongoing right now that are related to the pandemic and other goals. Then I have two more countries to share with you. So the first one is Indonesia. There we work on Islamic finance. And I'm not sure if any of you is familiar with the concept of sukuk, but it's kind of like a bond type of structure, but under a regime of Islamic finance. But in the end, you can do similar things with it as a bond. And we try to look for what we can do for biodiversity, for nature with green bonds. But we found actually you don't necessarily need the green bond. The conventional bond, or sukuk in this case, can also do something for nature. And we found that through this sort of conventional sukuk, we helped to catalyze an investment of $2.8 million for a bird conservation center. And that has been also approved last year. So this investment is already happening. And last but not least, I have to talk about Philippines, one of our most successful countries. We worked, first of all, on the protected area system. When we did, again, this analysis in the beginning, that's why this is so important, we found that there are a lot of protected areas, they hardly get any money. And so we started to see, why is that? Well, they were actually proclaimed, but they were not written into the law. And therefore, they were not entitled to the public budget that other protected areas got. And this is actually more than 90 protected areas. So we first of all helped in 2018 to remedy that, to write new legislation, and that was approved by the parliament and working with a parliament member, so that those 94 protected areas were written into the law. And then we also helped to develop underlying regulations for the protected area system that allows some new mechanisms like public-private partnerships. And then we helped to develop a new budget proposal, and that's totaled more than $40 million for 3 years, so that all those new protected areas that are, well, new in terms of the law, they could all do initial management plan and other basic investments that are needed to run such a protected area. And so in terms of the financial numbers, that's our biggest finance result we have seen so far. So I just want to highlight here that this implementation stage is ongoing. And we're going to continue at least until 2025 and hopefully beyond that. The last example I want to give is coming also from Philippines. It's an app, and it's called GCAS Forest. It's connected to a payment platform, GCash. And this is an app you can download if you're connected to that platform. And if you have the app and you carry out certain sustainable activities, like it can be anything, walking, for example, or you can buy organic products or renewable energy, every time you do one of those activities, you get points. And when you get points, a tree is growing in the app. And when the tree is fully grown, a real tree is being planted in the Philippines, starting in Manila watersheds. And by now, more than 120,000 trees have already been planted. So I think this is kind of a brand new business case in a way, because it combines a kind of more CSR perspective with a business for profit perspective, with a planet perspective. And so these are really, really interesting new examples that are emerging that hopefully we can see more in the future. And also it's one of the best examples we have using fintech. So those are sort of the things that I wanted to share upfront. And here are just a pointer to some of the tools that we have, our Biofin workbook, our website, and we have also an e-learning module and a podcast series. So you can find those all on our website. So that's all what I wanted to share. And back to you, Camille.
Great. Thank you so much for the very clear introduction to Biofin's work and your methodology, and also for all the examples. I think it was really thought-provoking to hear that there's so many mechanisms that can be used. I think for the people who have just joined, the second part of Impact from Home will be kind of an open Q&A. So feel free to drop your questions in the chat or ask them directly by turning your mic on. And we got one question that I think would be nice to address first, also for the newcomers. Which is about, is it fair to say conservation finance is the same as biodiversity finance, or is there a distinction between the two?
That's a great question that indeed needs to be addressed early on. So in my view, they're one and the same in a way, but actually I just want to refer to the Global Biodiversity Convention, where you get slightly different answers. So I think in practice, you can consider they're the same. But if you look at the convention, it has three main objectives. One is the conservation of biodiversity. Second objective is sustainable use. And the third one is access and benefit sharing. So I think that in one way, the answer is they're one and the same. If you look at the more sort of, from a legal perspective, actually biodiversity conservation includes also the sustainable use element and access and benefit sharing, with really important elements for sharing the use of genetic resources. This is in the pharmaceutical industry. It's a very big topic, and there are a lot of, it's called access and benefit sharing. There's specific mechanisms that are looking at this issue, making sure local communities can benefit from the resources that are found. So sometimes, special medicines are developed based on things that are found in local areas, and communities should be able to benefit when such a discovery is made.
Yeah, thank you for that. We have also a couple questions on some more country examples. I think it would be nice for the audience to learn more about some examples potentially in India, and we got another question about Nigeria. Is there anything you can share about those two places?
Right. So in Nigeria, we are not working. So our program doesn't include Nigeria.
Yeah.
But perhaps I can give an example from another African country, but I'll start then with India. So what we're doing in India is, again, quite different from other countries. We are working on CSR, corporate social responsibility, because two things I have to mention. One is CSR is mandatory in India, so in terms of like having your own CSR contribution, which is not like that in most countries. But in India it is, so companies are always on the lookout for projects. But we did a measurement and almost none of those projects are related to biodiversity. So what we're doing is we're helping to develop a kind of menu of options, what you can do for biodiversity with your CSR. And also we're highlighting then what are the socio-economic benefits of this project. So we're trying to look at things like community-based conservation, alternative livelihoods, because a lot of the CSR is of course people-centered, but there are a lot of win-wins where people and nature can really benefit. And so we're trying to identify in particular those. Another mechanism we're doing in India is actually the access and benefit sharing, where they developed a kind of initial methodology and how you do that, but it's a complex issue. And they are raising money for that. And now we're actually helping in particular to refine how you do the benefit sharing part, with, let's say, sizable populations and which geographic area can exactly benefit. And a last example from India is we're helping to green the agricultural schemes. So they're major public budget. This is like huge finance flow, the public budget schemes in India. So we're helping to see how they can be made, let's say, more green and have less negative or more positive impact. So that's some examples from, and then let me just give an example from South Africa, which is, let's say, one of our main focal countries in Africa. We have a really interesting mechanism there, which is a tax break for private protected areas. So there are quite a few private reserves in South Africa. And this tax break, which has been already adopted, it was not actually, we are actually supporting it at a later stage, but other organizations supported it before. If you apply for the tax break, you can write off the entire value of your land from future tax bills. So it's a really interesting example where you create an incentive where you're not trying to create more money, but you create an incentive that's still related to finance, where people are then encouraged to design and establish new protected areas. And the first ones have already been established under this new regime.
Mm-hmm. Actually, on the topic of tax, we have Gaurav Pundir mentioning that he was curious to understand the role of tax policy in fostering adequate financing for biodiversity conservation. Yeah, could you shed a little bit more light on that and how tax can be used?
Yes, actually, there's a problem, and this is actually the issue of earmarking for biodiversity conservation. So actually, if you look at, so I talked about expenditures, positive and negative. I didn't talk about revenue. So take the example of Botswana. There's a lot of revenue coming from those protected areas, but is it also going back? So the answer in many cases is no. And this is actually a huge challenge. And it's kind of, we researched that, and it's kind of coming from, let's say, IMF recommended practices and policies. Maybe currently we can try to convince them that we actually have this in mind, to, not to allow so much earmarking, because it fragments your budget. You can imagine that if you start to do earmarking for this and that, and then everything is important, it becomes a rather messy affair. And so we also understand that. But the earmarking of revenues from biodiversity related taxes and natural resource user fees is a major challenge for biodiversity. So actually it's very successful in generating money, but that money is then not going back into nature. So this is, I think, is one of the fundamental problems for biodiversity that we are trying to resolve. And there are different ways to do it. So for example, you can create what they call conservation trust funds, where you channel this money not into the treasury, but into a dedicated fund, and that fund will spend it back. So you kind of bypass, the treasury and its system, but you can still reserve the money for conservation. And so the other example is tax breaks, which is an interesting different perspective. So that's what we're doing in South Africa, but also, for example, in Kazakhstan, related to ecotourism. So we're trying to see there how we can incentivize people to invest in ecotourism as opposed to conventional tourism that has more a bigger footprint on nature. Mm-hmm. And I would just like to use the opportunity to say hello to my good friend Jan Wixton, who's joined us. Great to see you here.
Well, also something that I was curious about when I read through the Biofin catalog that has more than 150 solutions available to countries is how do you select the appropriate ones, and how many can you actually really implement in a plan? Are you said something like 5 to 10. How does that work?
Yeah, so indeed, so this catalog was actually kind of like a spin-off product. We started to realize we have to advise countries on mechanisms. We have to know, first of all, which ones there are. And we started to map them, and we found there are actually much more than we initially even could dream of. And we keep finding new ones all the time. And so we use this catalog as a starting point. So we just give them the countries, we select like a team of people, experts, let's say politicians, decision makers, civil society combined, and they're going through that whole catalog. And they're doing kind of almost a box ticking exercise to see, is it at all an idea or not? So this is what we call long listing. And then you end up with maybe like 60 solutions. And that goes in a kind of short listing. So which one do we think have a viable case? And then we have a methodology on how you do a scoring. And there are 3 principal criteria. First one is, it seems very evident, but biodiversity impact. So it's not even all the green mechanisms, and so many things may not evidently have a biodiversity positive impact. So it's really important to keep emphasizing that. The second criteria is actually financial potential. So of course, we don't want to focus on too many like small things. We need a kind of sizable scale to really finish, not finish, but reduce the finance gap. And the third one is feasibility. So we can think of some wild dream, like a new tax, or we can do like try to reform all the subsidies, or debt for nature swap, which is really popular right now. It's rather challenging because you have to go international negotiations. So feasibility needs its own scoring. And often we find that it's better to start with what you already have. So like public budgets, look first those mechanisms that you already have. It's easier to scale them up or improve them rather than starting something totally new and innovative. So we recommend then, once you have then this short list, we recommend look also at the mix. So try some low-hanging fruit and combine also some ambitious ones that are really needed, and maybe some innovative ones that could be also interesting. So, but try, just like an investor, you have to look at the mix, some low risk, some medium risk, and just one or two high risk in there. And so countries have indeed between 5 to 15 solutions in their plan. Sometimes they actually change them, like now with COVID-19, for example, some mechanisms are no longer as viable, or actually more important is a lot of different mechanisms have suddenly more potential or become more important. Like if you look at protected areas, the ones near cities, they've seen actually visitor increases, and many of the ones that depend on international tourism, they're down and almost out. So we have to also adapt, be a little bit adaptive.
Mm-hmm. And I guess this only works also if the government's on board. One question that came from Vivian Cavalcanti is about, what happens if the government is not on board, if there are regulations that don't, facilitate these projects being implemented, and maybe also if there are kind of conflicting interests. So she mentions that there might be some corporates that are pushing for deforestation. How do you work in those contexts where you have these challenges?
Right, so here it's really important to do, first of all, UNDP by default works with the government. So we don't go without the government. We really need government's involvement. And it's a dialogue, so we can also bring new ideas, and governments are open. So maybe some, you have to find what works. So some are politically more sensitive than others. But what is really important, if you look at specific mechanism, is do a very careful stakeholder analysis, if not a political economy analysis. So if you look at something like subsidies, you have to do a very strong political economy analysis, and you have to see who are, if you change this subsidy, what are, let's say, the winners and losers. But you can also try to go one better. How can we redesign a subsidy in a way that maybe the similar people can still benefit? But now, for example, we transform a conventional agriculture subsidy into, for example, organic one, or something that supports renewable, regenerative agriculture, where a similar group is still benefiting, but in a different way for something sustainable. So this political dimension is really very critical. Yeah. And we have to do, depending on the mechanism, quite detailed stakeholder analysis and really map like what are the different perspectives. And also it's really important that vulnerable groups, they're like high in the UN, they're of course number one on our agenda for considering the impact on their livelihood, so that make sure that they don't see any negative impact. We have a system of safeguards. We have actually risk analysis and safeguards as well. And vulnerable and indigenous groups are number one on the list to look at. So those are some of the sort of considerations that we take into account when doing this work.
Yeah. And then does that also explain why Biofin isn't currently in some other countries like Nigeria? Because, it's been difficult to get in touch with those governments.
No, actually, I remember that actually a sub-national government sent us a letter to express interest. So this also can happen from Nigeria, but that's not actually the answer. So, I mean, I don't want to go into how we select the countries, but simply we had to start with the countries that already have good capacity on this, because they had to apply to new methodology. We also have the more mega diverse countries in the sort of initial group, but now we're trying to expand, and we're looking, for example, at geographic coverage. And actually any country is welcome to do this. And what's really interesting is that they're developing now the new strategy for biodiversity for the new decade. And one of the targets under discussion is for every country in the world to do a biodiversity finance plan. That will include the developing countries, but also Netherlands and United States, and actually any country in the world would then do that. And I think, to be more precise on why, for example, we haven't worked in Nigeria, I mean, it's a kind of two-way traffic. So first of all, from the central government, we didn't receive an expression of interest, but from many other countries we did. So it depends a little bit on that. But also we have, of course, still it's a quite sizable program, but we have funding limitations. So we don't adopt too many new countries because we really want to focus on this implementation and not having to stop in one country to start in the other.
Yeah, definitely quality over quantity. And then here we have a question from Jan Wingston about how long is a Biofin mandate?
Jan, great question. So that's a bit of a moving target because so normally this initial phase is a 2-3 year process to design the finance plan, reduce expense review, and so on. But then the implementation, from our perspective, we want to continue until the finance needs are really being addressed. So for now, as a program, we continue until the end of 2025. But we're already trying to see if we can extend that to 2030. Because if you look at subsidy reform, it's not going to happen in 2-3 years. If you look at fiscal reform, if you look at transformational change, this is really requiring a lot of time. And even some more straightforward mechanism that requires a change, for example, in legislation, it can suddenly take 2-3 years extra. Sure. And we don't want to develop what we call half-baked mechanisms. So sometimes, for example, trust funds were designed in the past that were not actually, if you look carefully, they're not operating properly. And Jan, like me, is familiar with Mongolia. And there are some examples there for example, there's public funds that don't work well because it was not well articulated exactly what the fund should do. It sounds unbelievable, but it's true. I worked for something called the Clean Air Fund that was mentioned in your introduction. And in that fund, actually, it was not really delineated what the fund should do and what should not do. So those things really need time. And we rather spend more time to do it well. And simply, it's not, I mean, a crowdfunding campaign you can launch in a short time, and most of the kind of mechanism that we work on. And the last thing I want to say here is that the biodiversity situation is not exactly going for the better right now. It's going for the worse. I mean, there's a really amazing international momentum, but look at the species I mentioned at the beginning. So many species are really under pressure. So it's actually really, really urgent. Like we have to, step up our support rather than reduce.
Yeah, this was actually another of my questions about the effect of the pandemic. Did that not help bring this topic higher on the agenda? How do you see that playing out?
Yeah, so the impact is happening on different levels. So first of all, we focus on the, let's say, negative impact on tourism revenues, which is huge all around the world. So we're trying, we did the crowdfunding, but it's really, of course, just a stopgap. But we're also trying to see how can we identify alternative revenue sources and how can countries become less dependent on tourism. And we also analyze which mechanisms were doing better than others. So actually countries that have a conservation trust fund, which puts the money that they have away to invest it, and with only the, let's say, profit, so it's going basically through an investor, only the profit is being used on conservation and the money stays. This is actually a sustainable mechanism. But if you look at tourism revenues, they were down, public budgets were down, even private CSR, a lot of things were down. So some mechanisms were more effective than others. And also the debt situation is very pressing as an additional problem. So we try to also advocate why biodiversity investments have to remain very important priority, even though vaccines and hospitals and ventilators, of course, are immediate priority of governments, but these investments are really critical. But also the debt situation changed things because at the same time, the governments are more receptive to look at revenue generation, reforming subsidies, and also debt for nature swaps, because they need this fiscal space. Mm-hmm. So you can tackle it from different angles. So you can try to generate, it's exactly what Biofin does. You can generate more income, or you can reduce the needs. And if you transform a subsidy, you could have like a really good formula there, although we can safely say that very few countries have actually gone as far as reforming a lot of subsidies lately. But we do see a lot of momentum, and in particular in the financial sector. There's actually something being launched right now, which is called the Task Force for nature-related financial disclosures. Because one of the fundamental problems of private sector engagement is that private sector has even less data than the public sector. They have no data on what they're doing. So we knocked on the door of many companies and almost nobody answered in the sense of what they're doing on biodiversity. France is the first country who made it mandatory to report on that. But this task force is looking at bringing the financial sector together from a number of countries and including commercial and public institutes, and coming up with a kind of common framework for disclosing the dependencies, impacts, and risks that are related to nature, which are largely unmeasured and unreported right now. So this could be one of the great things happening in the coming 10 years, that financial institutes are going to internalize what they do relate to biodiversity. That could quite change the equation in many different ways. So this is one of sort of hopeful interventions that we are seeing around the world.
Mm-hmm. Well, actually, this is really closely related to one of the questions of Anand. Maybe you want to turn your mic on and ask them to Onno directly about, private sector involvement in biodiversity finance.
Yeah, sure thing. Thanks. Hi, Onno. So I was wondering, you mentioned that the private sector is a really small slice of the pie when it comes to biodiversity finance, right? But does Biofin have any models or incentives that you hope to implement to kind of grow that investment in biodiversity finance?
Right. So I think one reason why it's a small share of the pie is simply because there's no data. So let's see what happens when we have the data. Maybe the pie will be already a little bit bigger than we thought. But there are also other perspectives. And so if you look what the private sector can do, so I already mentioned CSR. So that's one sort of entry point, which is sometimes can be easier. And there's still significant finance flow. So let's try to see what we can find there. But then, of course, I like to always distinguish between the two sides of the coin. So how can we reduce the negative things that have a negative impact on biodiversity, and how can we catalyze those positive investments? So they require a different approach, both of them. So in terms of the positive ones, actually demand for biodiversity positive investments in the world is bigger than the supply. So right now, there are a lot of people trying to set up like biodiversity funds and so on, and they find there are no projects. And this is same as for other green finance categories and climate. And so one of the things that we need to do is help to develop this pipeline of projects. And so the example I mentioned from Mexico is one, where we can help to develop bankable projects. But because a lot of those conservation projects are kind of small, too small, they don't sit well in a kind of investment portfolio kind of scale. So we have to sort of try to find kind of intermediates, first of all, as an interlocutor with those investors, but also ideally bringing them together in some kind of like fund or structure, and in particular also building their capacity. So how do you deal with an investor? And then there's the international and national dimension. So this accelerator fund is one of the examples that we have to sort of increase the pipeline. Then if you look at the, again, other side of the coin, things of course like certification, are really important. They need to be strengthened. And one interesting observation I had there is that countries have a lot of different types. So I was in a meeting a couple of years ago where we looked at sustainable consumption and production in a link with biodiversity. And then the person from Japan said, yeah, we have more than 50 certification mechanisms that speak to biodiversity. And then the person from India said, well, we have more than 500. So there's a need for streamlining them. We're also doing some work on that, but yeah, certification is one thing, but also simply regulations and negative screening. I think there's a lot of work to be done. We have to look at, again, the carrot and the stick. So we need to look at some regulatory instruments, as well as the TNFD is a voluntary concept. I think those may have more potential, or the kind of stuff that we're doing in Sri Lanka, where you develop a kind of strategy together with the private sector. So we have to always look at all the options, and that's kind of one of the strengths of Biofin, is that you look at always all the options and see which one can work. So it's not a cookie cutter approach, but of course, there's also, I can admit, there's some kind of weakness in this approach, because you end up doing a lot of different things. It can be easy to do the same in every country, actually, from a management perspective. But in a way, I think what is more important that these solutions are taken up by the countries, and that there's awareness on what can be tried, and you can try a couple of different ones and then see which one works for that country and for that sector with that stakeholder.
Yeah, I think also looking at time, because we're getting close to the 1 hour mark, I had maybe a more personal question for you, since we're also, bringing together a group of professionals around impact and sustainability. I think it'd be interesting to know kind of what gets you motivated and excited on a day-to-day basis about your work, and what are some of the yeah, the projects that you're most excited about in the coming month, year or so.
Yeah, I think what makes me excited is actually especially this implementation stage, because as you can imagine, doing all those expenditure reviews, and it was intellectually interesting, but we were also getting quite impatient to work on the ground, which we had to wait for a couple of years.
Yeah.
So I think I'm more excited about that. I mean, you can imagine some people have maybe a more, let's say, academic preference, then that can be something you get more excited about. But I get more excited about seeing a real change on the ground. So the graph that I showed with some of the finance results, to me shows really what is the potential. So just imagine that a lot of the countries that we work, we have just a budget of $250,000. Like for example, Botswana, and we can help generate a revenue of more than $1 million per year. Same for Kazakhstan, where we saw this investment. So we have relatively limited budgets, but this is a real strategic issue. And I call it finance for finance. So we use finance to generate or realign finance rather than just, for its direct impact. And I think this is to see these real results on the ground and see that it's really possible. That's quite amazing. And also it's just amazing to work with those teams around the world. So we found actually every country where we think, okay, maybe the finance capacity is not that good, but we found amazing people all over the world. And we have the kind of luxury to work, like I'm sometimes in a call with people from 40 countries or more. So we can work together and share experiences. And I can really see that things are changing in terms of biodiversity finance. So it takes a long time to build the capacity of everyone involved. But I do see it happening, and I like this idea of the national results. And I think that the last 1.5 years, biodiversity has come even more to the forefront of international agendas, in particular in the finance sector. And so I hope that a lot more can happen, and that let's say 5 years from now, we see a lot more of the similar mechanisms in a lot more countries that have actually come to maturity. Because when they come to maturity, then only, of course, we have a lot of mechanisms also there still work in progress. And when they come to maturity, of course, that's the most exciting part. I also have a personal preference for working with local communities. So community-based conservation is my other passion in conservation next to finance. And when we can combine them, that's great. So the crowdfunding was really good because we can have a direct impact. And you see, it brings out the best in people. So we saw, for example, influencers, politicians, mayors, designers, suddenly my family members, everyone suddenly became aligned to support such a campaign. So that was also particularly rewarding.
Yeah, really inspiring. And maybe as a closing question, this was one submitted by Wolfram about how can we all contribute to Biofin's mission, or how can we get involved with the topic of biodiversity in our respective roles and companies.
Yes, I think sort of the bad news that I mentioned in the beginning is that many SMEs are not doing well, but the good news is actually that there is a lot you can do. So I think crowdfunding is the first thing I want to mention. So if you look on the internet, there are a lot of campaigns going on. We're still doing one in Costa Rica, for example, which is more on tree planting. But there are all over the internet, you can find examples. And in this pandemic, I mean, people, of course, want to focus on saving lives, and rightfully so. But there are also other things we can do in terms of supporting vulnerable communities that are doing actually conservation work for us. So crowdfunding, and there are also maybe some interesting examples for more the equity model, which I didn't talk about. So we're talking about the donation charity model. So that's definitely one thing to do. But I think also increasingly, there's a rise in different funds where you can put your own savings, or you can help to create such a fund if you're working in a financial institute. So I don't want to mention any specific bank, but in the Netherlands, there are a lot of banks working on that, looking on the sustainable funds. And I think the first generation of those funds was a kind of doing a negative screening. So how can we have a portfolio that doesn't have harm the environment? But I think now they're really looking at the biodiversity and climate positive, and the climate and biodiversity in the end go hand in hand, of course. So I think putting your own savings in something like that, or if you're working in a company, if you have any kind of product, you can always integrate biodiversity in there. You can always do this, look at the two sides of the coin. Make sure you don't have negative impacts or minimize your negative impacts, and see what are those biodiversity positive impacts and join the international community working on this issue. So somewhere around the world will be already dealing with the same question that you are. And finally, on a personal level, of course, there's a lot of sustainable things we can do, and buying organic products and reducing the consumption of meats should be high on the list if you look at deforestation in the Amazon, for example.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. Well, we have 1 minute to go until 1, so I'm gonna say a big thank you to you, Onno, for your time and for your insights, and also to the audience for all your thoughtful questions. Call this the end of the Impact from Home number 24. We hope to see you at the next session that will be on the topic of professional fulfillment, scheduled on June 18th. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and see you soon.